Pornography is very reinforcing for some people. It's very pleasurable. Usually when people use pornography, they're also simultaneously masturbating, and then that leads to orgasm, and orgasm is really the drug. So what happens in the brain as people become addicted? 안녕하세요, Book and Life Channel. My name is 애나렘키. I am a physician. I practice at the Stanford University School of Medicine in Stanford, California. So the reason that people should be very wary of addiction to the internet and technology is because it really can lead to a phenomenology that looks identical to addiction to drugs and alcohol: physical harm, relationship harm, work harm, school harm, psychospiritual harm like anxiety, depression, and even in extreme cases, suicidal ideation. And you can also argue that digital addiction causes harm to others. So for example, people who get addicted to sex and pornography, those are not, those are behaviors that can potentially cause harm to other people who are being used and exploited. People can get addicted to videos of animals, and animals can be exploited. People can act in ways online because of their addiction that is harmful to other humans. And that when they get out of their addiction and they go and look back, they can feel a lot of shame and regret. All things that are pleasurable or reinforcing through various different chemical cascades ultimately release dopamine in the brain's reward pathway. Dopamine is essential for the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation, and has come to be considered the kind of common currency by which neuroscientists measure how reinforcing substances and behaviors are. So for example, there's a series of experiments where they put a probe into a rat's brain, right into the reward circuitry to measure dopamine levels in response to different types of reinforcers. Now, keep in mind that dopamine is always being released at a baseline tonic level. But in these experiments, what they found was that chocolate increased dopamine firing 50% above baseline. Sex was 100% above baseline. A cigarette was 150% above baseline. And stimulants like cocaine and amphetamine, 1,000% above baseline. So that gives us some idea about how reinforcing those substances are, at least in rats. We can't do similar experiments in humans because we can't just stick a probe in the nucleus accumbens, but there are imaging studies showing that reward pathway increases dopamine firing in response to a variety of reinforcers, and that most things that are intoxicating, like drugs, alcohol, tend to release more dopamine more quickly. Those are the things that tend to have the potential for addiction. So what happens in the brain as people become addicted is that essentially change their level of dopamine firing in a part of the brain called the reward pathway. Initially, when we do things that are reinforcing or that feel good, dopamine firing increases. But in order to compensate or adapt to that increased level of dopamine, the brain downregulates dopamine receptors and dopamine transmission, not just to baseline, but actually below baseline. And we enter a chronic dopamine deficit state, which can feel just like clinical depression, clinical anxiety, insomnia, dysphoria, and also that state of craving, that state of constantly wanting to use our drug again. So what's happening to all of us is that we're losing the capacity to sustain our attention. And so when there's a longer format, it becomes much more difficult for us to patiently wait for the content to be delivered. We want that immediate quick fix. We want it to go to the punchline, and then we want to move right on to the next new thing. And the more new things we have, the more new things we want. We get less and less patient, and we lose the ability to actually wait for things. There are studies showing that the more people consume digital media, the more likely they are to meet criteria for attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. What is the meaning of sex? Is sex sort of a sacred act that allows us to experience deep intimacy with other people? That's how I think about it. Sex just a way to get off, right? Get and pleasure myself. And when we use sex in that way, we're really using it as a drug, and we're then using other people too as a drug. And that's what makes it, sex addiction so complicated. There's so much shame and stigma around it because it often is a behavior that involves involves other people in some way. Even if it's just pornography, then people who were in the pornography were, you could say they were exploited in some way. And it also often, as with many addictions, involves a lot of lying and subterfuge. So then you get the eroding of our intimacy with our real life partners because of this behavior, this kind of double life that we're leading where we're not being honest about what we're doing. Yeah, so pornography is very reinforcing for some people. It's very pleasurable. Usually when people use pornography, they're also simultaneously masturbating, right? And then that leads to orgasm. And orgasm is really the drug, the pornography plus the orgasm. And that's a big dopamine hit for some people. So what happens is that over time, we start to change our hedonic or joy set point, and then we need more potent forms of our drug, whatever it is, to get the same effect. So when we're talking about pornography and sex addiction, people experience that as needing more deviant forms of pornography, or they more time with pornography, or they need to do it more frequently. They need to masturbate more often. And then often it'll escalate to going from, sort of regular pornography to deviant pornography, sometimes child pornography. And then it may escalate to, chat rooms and interacting with live people. And then it may escalate to actually getting together with people, escorts, and so on. So there's this kind of escalation over time, which is exactly what we see with drugs and alcohol, right? You start out where a little bit of alcohol or a little bit of drug works, but over time it stops working. You need more to get the same effect. Same thing happens with pornography. I believe that when we overuse smartphones or other forms of digital media, we're actually stimulating the same reward pathways as drugs and alcohol, and we're changing our brain in the process. One of the things that I talk about is the fact that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain and work like opposite sides of a balance. And the more that we press on that pleasure side, the more that our brain compensates on the pain side. I often talk about imagining that there are these neuroadaptation gremlins that hop on the pain side of the balance to try to bring it level again, because one of the things about this pleasure-pain balance is that it wants to maintain what neuroscientists call homeostasis, or a level balance. But the thing about those gremlins is they like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as it's level. They stay on until the balance is tilted and equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's the come down, the hangover, the after effect, or that state of craving, wanting to have one more YouTube video, watch one more TikTok, play one more video game, post one more thing on social media. Now, if we don't repeat the behaviors, eventually those gremlins hop off and homeostasis is restored. But if we continue to consume our drug of choice over many days or weeks or months, those gremlins on the pain side of the balance start to multiply. Pretty soon we have enough to fill this whole room. And eventually we enter addicted brain. An addicted brain is characterized by a pleasure-pain balance that's chronically tilted to the side of pain. Those gremlins are now camped out on the pain side of the balance. And once that happens, we've changed our hedonic or joy set point. Now we need more of our drug in more potent forms, not to get high and tilt to the side of pleasure, but just to level the balance and feel normal. And importantly, when we're not using, we're walking around with a pleasure-pain balance tilted to the side of pain, experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. And that's why people will continue to use their drug of choice even after it's no longer pleasurable, even after they see that it's causing all kinds of problems. It's because the physiologic drive to try to restore homeostasis is almost overwhelming, especially if we are surrounded by easy access to our drug of choice. And digital media works on this same pleasure-pain balance, right? We watch a TikTok video that releases dopamine in the reward pathway, tilts to the side of pleasure, but then those gremlins hop on the pain side. We continue to consume digital media, and we eventually end up in this kind of chronic dopamine deficit state. That's the addiction vortex. Once we get caught in it, it's very hard to get out of it. But the way to get out is to abstain for a period of time long enough for those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance, for dopamine levels to come back up to healthy baseline levels, and for homeostasis to be restored. So, in my book, Dopamination, I talk about how I got addicted to romance novels. And I've always been a reader, but at some point in midlife, I started to read romance novels compulsively. It started with the Twilight Saga, which is this vampire romance series for teenagers. For whatever reason, that just hit my dopamine sweet spot. And I began reading all the other romance novels about vampires. I was off and running. But the thing that really did me in was when I got a Kindle or an e-reader. And then I started staying up later and later each night, reading romance novels. Even when I had to get up early the next day, I would go to work exhausted. I would come home and the first thing I wanted to do was just read romance novels. I didn't want my kids to bother me. I just wanted to read romance novels. And gradually over time, I got more depressed and more anxious. I was getting less and less sleep. And really my sort of focus narrowed such that I was only wanted to do this one thing, read romance novels. And when I realized that I was becoming addicted to romance novels, I was surprised because it happened very gradually. So I didn't really see it as it was happening, even though I'm an addiction doctor, which says something about how insidious the process can be. And what I did about it was the same thing I recommended to my patients. I recommended a 30-day dopamine fast, knowing that the first 10 to 14 days will be very difficult. We'll go into acute withdrawal. But if we can just make it to weeks 3 or 4, we will feel better, not just better than we did in the first 10 to 14 days, but better often than we have in a really long time. So that's what I did. I got rid of my Kindle. I pledged to not read any romance novels. And the first thing I discovered was that I had a lot of difficulty going to sleep at night. So I had developed a whole routine around using romance novels to put myself to sleep. And without them, I became acutely anxious. My mind was racing. I was uncomfortable in my body and in my own thoughts and up for several hours. And that was very uncomfortable. But as the nights wore on, my brain eventually calmed down. I was able to go to sleep. I was feeling less anxious. I was feeling less depressed. And after 4 weeks of no romance novels, I really felt much, much better. So then I thought, well, I'm all cured and I can go back to reading romance novels. So that weekend I started to read romance novel and I binged all weekend long. So I got right back into my routine. And we see that often when people stop using their drug of choice, they reset their reward pathways, then they go back to using and they have a worse episode than they've had for a long time. We call that a binge, or sometimes it's called the abstinence violation syndrome. So I binged all weekend long on romance novels and I was bleary-eyed when I went to work on Monday morning again, felt hungover, hadn't had enough sleep, couldn't really concentrate. And that's when I realized, oh, wow, I actually probably can't read romance novels anymore. I'm going to have to give them up permanently. So that is what I did. And, the intervention that we do is essentially to ask people to abstain from all orgasms with themselves or others. So no orgasms and no pornography or other sexual encounters for 30 days as kind of an initial entry. And people will experience significant withdrawal from that. The most prominent and common withdrawal symptoms from pornography are things like anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, a lot of craving and wanting to use as a release, but also people can have physical symptoms of withdrawal, headache, stomach ache, sweating, nausea. So we also see physical symptoms of withdrawal. But the nice thing is that over time, those start to get better. And usually by about 4 weeks, the acute withdrawal is over. Craving is less. People's moods are improved. And they're able to then reflect more deeply about their addiction, including their pornography addiction. I hope you got what you needed. 감사합니다.